Well, so we've seen that the whole idea that nobody can ever judge anybody for any reason, we've seen that that's self-contradictory. We've seen that making judgments is necessary. It's a necessary part of life. We've seen that if nobody was ever allowed to judge anybody else, you couldn't even have a legal system. And I think something else we can also point out is that when we make moral judgments, when we as Christians, when we stand up in culture, when we have a voice, and when we do so properly, with the right attitude, of course, when we make moral judgments, and ultimately, it's really God, not us, who's making that judgment anyway. And what I mean by that is, we didn't write the rules. Yeah, He did. We're just pointing to the rules that He has established. And so, for example, when we stand up at the right time, and when we say, you know what, sexual immorality is wrong, it's not wrong because we say so. It's wrong because God says so. And you know, in today's culture, it's really easy for people to just dismiss us and to just brush us aside and just ignore us and say, who are you to judge? Who are you to judge? And so it's easy for people to dismiss us, but I mean, who in their right mind on the day of judgment, when they stand before a holy God, who in their right mind is going to look him in the face and say, who are you to judge? Nobody's going to say that. Nobody. In fact, it reminds me of this meme I ran across. Like, people be like, only God can judge me. I'd be like, that should scare you. It's a sobering thought. We hear that a lot from people. Have you heard that? You hear people say, only God can judge me. I've seen that a lot, but yeah. Think through the implications of that. Well, I mentioned earlier that sometimes when people give us a little bit of pushback, sometimes they'll say, well, doesn't the Bible say you're not supposed to judge? Doesn't that? In fact, they're quoting Matthew 7. They'll say, do not judge, or you too will be judged. And you have to admit, and by the way, I'm always amazed at people who don't even believe the Bible. They've taken the time to memorize this verse, right? It's about the only verse that they memorize in the Bible. But what do you do with that? Because you have to admit, at a first glance, you go, man, it does kind of seem like, what do you do with that? Well, as Greg Kokel and others rightly point out, you have to make sure you don't take verses out of context. Make sure that you read everything around that. And so let's look a little bit further at the rest of Matthew 7. And here's what it says. It says, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will what? Then you will see clearly to what? Remove the speck from your brother's eye. So notice that Jesus is not saying that we're never allowed to judge anyone. That's not what he's saying. In fact, he tells us, he instructs us to do what? To remove the speck from your brother's eye. So clearly Jesus is not telling us, he's not condemning all judgments, just hypocritical ones. Just hypocritical judgments. For example, it's going to be really awkward if you're judging someone for gossiping, if you yourself are the biggest gossiper on campus, or if you're the biggest gossiper in the office. It's going to be really awkward. So he's not judging. He's not condemning all judgments, just when we judge hypocritically. But even though Jesus condemns hypocritical judgments, in John 7, he does tell us to make accurate judgments. In fact, he says, stop judging by mere appearances and make a right judgment. So Jesus is telling us to make accurate judgments and not superficial ones. That's really what he's telling us. So, for example, say you're at the mall, and say from a distance you recognize a couple people and you know both of them and you know that each of them are married, but they're not married to each other, but you see them together. In a sense, you don't want to judge that they're having an affair because you don't know. You really don't know. So it's not something you want to do. But you know what? On the other hand, if you know for a fact that they are, if there's no question, if you know for certain that they are, then now you have more information, and now you can make a right judgment, and now you can make an accurate judgment, and you can say, you know what, this relationship is wrong. It's wrong because God says that it's wrong. And when it comes to this, we have to keep this in mind. It's really important we keep in mind and to point out to other people that when it comes to right and wrong, God's rules apply to everybody. Even the unbeliever, even the person who denies God's existence, that his rules apply to everybody. As the Creator, his rules apply to everybody. Well, by now I hope you realize that judging is not always a bad thing. It's not always a bad thing. And this might make us uncomfortable, but I'll be honest with you. All of us, myself included, all of us from time to time need other people to judge us. And the reason I say that is because all of us from time to time need others to hold us accountable, to be held accountable by those who know us best, by those who are closest to us. And a part of being held accountable includes that we have to allow this person to be able to judge whether or not we're doing the right thing. And I'll just be honest with you, I expect other people to judge me. I actually need other people to judge me. And the reason I say that is because, just like anybody else, I have my own blind spots. I have my own moral failures. And this is why it's important for me to surround myself with others who are more objective, who can point out things in my life that aren't right, and who can hold me accountable. As long as they're doing so with the right motives. In other words, to help me grow, to make me a better person. And notice that I said, as long as they do so with the right motives. But what do you do when somebody's judging you? They're just being mean and nasty, and it's just really obvious. They're just a mean, critical person. Well, you know what? There's some criticisms you can just let go. You can just dismiss some of those criticisms. And as somebody has said, and I think it's great advice, and they said, don't count your critics, weigh them. I think that's good advice. Don't count your critics, weigh them. And basically what that's saying is that if somebody points out something in our life and it needs to be addressed, and if it's coming from someone that you admire, that you respect, that you trust, chances are it's probably true. And if it is, then we need to take their criticism seriously, even if it makes us uncomfortable. We need to take it seriously. So in summary, this whole idea that no one should ever judge anyone for any reason, it's not only irrational, it's not only unlivable, it's really, honestly, it's just kind of a cheap, empty slogan that has been circulating over and over through our culture. And so this raises a really interesting question, an important question. And that is, if that's all it is, if it's just sort of a cheap, empty slogan, then why have so many bought into this lie? Why is it that people get so defensive when anyone makes judgments? Why is it that our culture places such as this huge emphasis on never judging anyone else? Well, I think you know why. I think I know why, and it basically comes down to this. And that is, we're afraid that if we point out immoral behavior in someone else's life, they're going to point out immoral behavior in our life. If we point a finger at them, they're going to point a finger right back at us. That's really the reason. And so in order to avoid that, it's almost as if we've entered into this unspoken social contract with everybody around us, and it basically goes something like this. It says, hey, look, I won't point out what you're doing wrong if you don't point out what I'm doing wrong. I won't tell on you if you don't tell on me. I won't judge you if you don't judge me. And ladies and gentlemen, this is how our culture attempts to run and hide from the guilt that we're feeling for the things that we're doing that we know are wrong. It's really an attempt on our part to deny true moral guilt. But as someone has said, maybe we feel guilty because we are guilty. Because deep down inside, we know that we're guilty of violating God's laws. And we know that he has the authority to hold us accountable. And we know that we have to answer for that someday. However, the answer to guilt is not denial. It's not running and hiding from our guilt. Nor can we cover up our guilt by foolishly declaring no judgment zones. The only real answer to our guilt is forgiveness. And the only way that you and I will ever be free from our guilt and to experience God's forgiveness is to come to the cross and to surrender your life to Jesus Christ. Isn't that true?